peaceful community for over 50 years.
On Sunday, July 7th, 1935, the residents of Tyner, New York, crowded into their community church for an afternoon service. The Reverend Beckwith led the congregation with a hymn of prayer. A blessing of showers was all the people of Tyner could hope for. The tiny farming village in Chenango County was already struggling through a hot, dry summer, and their fields of corn and wheat were desperate for rain. But rain was about to fall, heavier and more violent than ever in the region's history. And before morning, homes, farms, and lives would be washed away. And so would the community church of Tyner.
This flood that we had in '35 was a surprise. It was really a cloudburst, and it really was the worst thing we ever had.
I can't think of a thing that has happened geographically as dramatic and as devastating as that flood was to our area.
There just wasn't the technology available in 1935 to warn the public effectively of an event like this, of this magnitude.
No one who lived through it has ever forgotten. It began the most destructive and deadly 24 hours in the history of the region since the Civil War. And when the flood was over, it had changed lives and the landscape of the southern tier forever. And although it was an event a century in the making, no one saw it coming.
In terms of coming up and doing the damage that the '35 flood caused, was in nobody's mind. I mean, it was just as far away as the atomic bomb, which hadn't been invented yet. I mean, it just, nobody thought about it.
My grandparents farmed. Most everybody was a farmer around here. There were little farms, so everybody was self-sufficient. They had their few cows they milked, they raised their gardens, they had chickens. They had, I mean, you didn't go to the store every day. When we lived upon the farm when I was 2, I remember my family only went to the store maybe once a month.
Back at that time in the 30s, Lyle was there was a lot going on. I think there was 5 stores, a meat market besides, a bank, 2 feed stores, post office, school, and I think there was a blacksmith shop left at that time. And not that we didn't go there, my dad did his own.
The village of Lyle was nestled 20 miles from Binghamton on the northern rim of Broome County. For its farmers, the summer meant long days working their fields, tending cattle and raising chickens. Every day, they would cart their milk to the Lyle Creamery, where it was loaded onto trains for New York City. $1 for a 90-pound keg, a good day's pay for the Depression.
You walked in the woods, you knew every tree, you knew every leaf. You studied nature with your parents.
We slid downhill in the wintertime, swam in the summertime, played kick the can and sheep come across at school. We used to fish in Dudley Creek.
Lyle, like most of the towns and villages throughout the southern tier, relied heavily on the creeks and streams for fresh water and power for their mills. The land along their banks became an ideal place to build a home. In 1935, Dudley Creek snaked through the center of Lyle, running past the prettiest homes in town on Collier and Cortland streets, before emptying into the Tyner River, a half-mile east of the village. The Tyner flowed south from Cortland, feeding and taking in dozens of streams along its journey south to Whitney Point, where it gathered in the Particilarly River. At no point along its path, which flowed around and under countless roads, bridges, and railroad lines, was the river's run impeded by levees or dams. The Tyner's journey ended at Chenango Forks, where it poured its contents into the Chenango River. But on Sunday, July 7th, very little water flowed through the rivers, streams, or Dudley Creek in Lyle. Weeks of sweltering heat and little rain had dried them to a trickle, making a safe playground for 12-year-old Ed Marks and his friend Lloyd Barrows.
Lloyd Barrows and I played in the creek, again with my goat and cart, and drawed sand to his house and to my house to play in. And I played with him the Saturday before the flood.
Growing up in Smithville was a wonderful experience. Things weren't organized at that time. You just went out, and if a bunch of fellows got together, you wanted to play baseball, pick up a bat, and a bunch of us got together and went up on the school grounds and played ball. And we would get sweaty and hot, and we'd go down to the creek and go swimming.
We swam off the dam. On one side there was a flat surface there, maybe 3 feet deep, and close to the Hansman's Mills there was deep water. And we had a lot of fun. In the wintertime, we were out there ice skating. We even had cars out there. Some of the old ones had old cars and they'd drag us around, so we had plenty of things to do.
Smithville was quite an active little community. We had 4 or 5 stores and I think 5 or 6 gas stations. I think there were a lot more people on the streets than that in those days. Tarble Farms was run by Gage Tarble, he was an attorney in New York, and actually this was more or less his plaything up here. And they raised golden Guernsey cows, some of the most real producers in the country. And for a long time, they would ship milk to New York.
And I can remember the fellow that drove the truck was E.J. Moore. And I can still see him coming around the corner down below town here with the water sloshing out of it because it was under ice and on a hot day. And that was going down to the train station Greene to be put on ice to go on down to New York City.
Long Pond was part of the Tarble estate. There was a dam there, and they used the water power to run a sawmill. But the one at the upper lake was more or less to just make a reservoir of the lake, mainly for the campers that were around there.
Cincinnatus Lake rested 3 miles above Smithville Flats, just above Tarbell Farms. The lake was created near the turn of the century to help attract campers and fishermen to the area. But over the years, the lake and its dam had also drawn the attention of some of those in Smithville Flats.
Before the flood, there was a considerable amount of worriment about the dam up at the upper lake. It was a laid-up dam of stone, and it wasn't very, very well made. And they didn't have good maintenance, really.
village officials feared that any breach of the dam would inundate Smithville Flats. But in 1935, the dam remained neglected, with assurances that it posed no threat to the village.
The air was nice. It was right on the river, and we had a lot of fun out there.
10-year-old Jackie Loomis lived with her family on Binghamton's south side. When Jackie was 6, she had contracted scarlet fever and became seriously ill. She survived, but developed the nervous disorder St. Vitus dens. That spring, Jackie's father, Harry, and his wife, Marguerite, decided to move the family out of the city in hopes that the fresh air might ease his oldest daughter's suffering.
We moved right after school was out in '35. It was on River Road, about 3 miles from the bridge, in a cottage on an island. There was myself, my brother was 9, my sisters were 3 and 6. There was another cottage, just 2 of us on the island. We had 1 pulley boat, and we could only use that to go from our house to the main road where our car was. My brother and I did a lot of things together. We were 13 months apart. We used to build airplanes and get up on the roof, and we got in a plane one day. He had me get in the plane, and he pushed it off the roof. And we thought it would fly, but it didn't. When we moved there, my father asked if there was ever any floods on that island, and they told him no, not in 50 years.
The rivers were used a lot for swimming. Certain locations where people would set up a diving board, or it would be a place where you could get in and out of the water easily. You'd go swimming once a day, usually, in the summer when it was hot. And my father, who was a lawyer at the time, he liked to swim, and many times I would wait at the house until he got home, and we'd walk down to the river and swim for 10, 15 minutes, and then come back and take a shower and have dinner.
Rivers, one time, were a part of our scenery here. They were beautiful. You look there, like from Round Top, look down and see the river going, meandering through the hills here and so forth. It was nice. It was, most of the time, was on the low side. We used to go down by the bank, especially when we were kids. We had our Easter vacation, so what do? We go down by the river. Well, we had fun. Oh, toss a stick around. Once in a while, we run into a snake or 2 or something like that. Sometimes we'd go out, maybe do a little fishing. Find any kind of a pole, a little piece of string, and have fun, little fun. We enjoyed it. Some people had rowboats. Well, we knew them, so we went out, rode on them. No, it was wonderful, beautiful.
During the early 1930s, nearly a dozen bath and boathouses dotted the banks of both the Chenango and Susquehanna rivers. For $1, you could rent a rowboat to take your best girl for a lazy afternoon ride to Lover's Lane, near the end of Front Street. On Thursday evenings, the river's edge was crowded with fishermen hoping to reel in Friday's dinner. But on that first Sunday in July, there were no swimmers in the rivers, no boats near Lover's Lane, and few poles in the water under the Washington Street Bridge. At 8 a.m. that morning, the Weather Bureau recorded the depth of the Chenango River at 1 foot 4 inches, its lowest level in years. It began on July 4th in eastern Montana, moving quickly east across the northern states. On the 5th, it was joined by another system streaming south out of the Canadian wilderness. On Sunday afternoon, July 7th, the storms had stalled over western and central New York, ready to erupt.
The day of the flood, I was in the afternoon, I was at the Whitney Point Fairgrounds with my father, who was a manager of a local ball team. The sky got very strange looking, yellowish cast, eerie color.
It was a cloudburst. There was large drops of water came down. I haven't seen anything like that since then. And I've been through some storms in the Pacific and so on, but nothing like that.
It just poured. See, that night it just poured. Seems so my mother was the dishes collecting water all around because it poured so bad.
The rain was relentless. As soon as one storm ended, another was ready to take its place.
Meteorologists commonly call this training. The front was like the train tracks, and then it was just one storm after the other, just followed the same path. And we all know it, when we have a thunderstorm, it rains really hard. But if you have 5 or 6 of those thunderstorms over your area in one day, you're going to get a lot of rain.
By 10 o'clock, more than 5 inches of rain had fallen in Watkins Glen, 6 in Ithaca, and in Cortland, at the mouth of the Chenango River, nearly 8 inches of rain had fallen with no end in sight. The parched, hardened soil couldn't absorb the rain fast enough, and it began pouring off the hills with incredible speed. Sewers began to back up, flooding streets, making driving nearly impossible. At 11 o'clock, the Chenango began spilling over its banks in Marathon, ripping through the village's business district. 10 miles south in Lyle, Dudley Creek had begun to rage.
The roar, you couldn't believe the roar of the creek.
Water had already begun to seep into the first floor of homes along Cortlandt Street and was rising at almost a foot a minute. Stones and branches, churned up by the raging waters, started beating against siding, shaking owners awake. Walter Barrows rushed to the first floor of his family's home on Collier Street. By the time he reached the stairs, the creek was already up to his waist. He gathered his family together in an upstairs bedroom. His wife, Hazel, his daughter, Anna, and her husband, Raymond, and his 10-year-old son, Lloyd, who clutched the family dog. At midnight, something struck the house with tremendous force, and it began to break apart. They rushed to the attic and climbed out onto the rain-soaked roof, now being pushed downstream. The frightened riders were pushed by the current until they became lodged against the home of Raymond Land. For over an hour, they sat in pouring rain and near complete darkness, the only light coming from a lantern placed in the Lamb's upstairs window. Above the roaring waters, they could hear the cries of terror from their neighbors as the town was torn apart. At 2 a.m., a wall of water tore the house free and sent it crashing into a bridge, shattering it and plunging the Barrows into the raging waters. My wife and I hung together, Walter later explained. I grabbed a tree, but my wife's strength gave way and the water swept her away. Anna and her husband worked their way to safety, but Lloyd, still holding his dog, was pushed downstream and was lost. A block away on Cortlandt Street, the terror continued. Scott Pope and his daughter Hazel were anxiously moving furniture to the second floor. Suddenly, the east wing of their home was ripped away from the house, carrying the pair with it. I tried to cling to my daughter with all my might, Mr. Pope wrote later. But she broke away, and the last I saw of her, she was being carried away on the current. Throughout the night, Dudley Creek raged against the village, washing away bridges, trees, utility poles, and cattle. By morning, Lyle would be completely cut off from the outside world, with no electricity, no phones, and no way in or out.
Every little brook seemed to be tremendous. There was that much rain that all little brooks were just roaring, big and roaring. It never was like that before.
We were in Greene, and when we came back, we came across this bridge over here, and it was pretty well washed over. There's water in it, and my dad drove it through. We got home, and the water kept rising all the time. My dad got quite concerned, and he moved us up to the hotel here in the middle of town, which is about 5 stories high. There's probably 40 or 50 people there, and we were up there for, that night. And that's when the worst of the flood was.
By 11 o'clock, the streets of Smithville Flats were already under 2 feet of water. Jenny Ganslet Creek had already begun to surround Hansman's Mills. People had started to gather what belongings they could carry and head for higher, safer ground.
The night of the flood, when Dad moved us from our house up to Whitehall Barn, the Presbyterian minister, Mr. Kilgus, and his family were there. And Mr. Kilgus had a kerosene lantern, and he was kind of hyper anyway. And he was swinging the lantern around. And my dad got a little bit upset and told him if he didn't put the damn lantern down, he's going to burn the barn up.
Mr. and Mrs. Ford lived just a half mile from the creek on West Avenue. When the water started to rise, they decided to stay put and ride out the storm. Just past midnight, the Fords and everyone else in Smithville heard the same unearthly sound.
You could hear the water roaring when it came down through. It must have been about midnight. You could just hear the water.
When that dam went out, of course, there was a rush of water, and that's when most of the buildings came down. We saw several houses come down through. We were in the hotel, and I remember looking out at one house when it came down through, and there was a chicken on the roof, and it hit the bridge down here, and it just demolished the house. It was a terrible noise.
The lake dove through the village, carrying trees, rocks, and debris under its waves. It surged through West Avenue, pushing itself under the foundation of the Ford's home. They could feel the house begin to tip and cried for help.
In order to get them out of the house, they threw a rope to them and they tied it off in the second story and brought it out to a tree and evacuated both of them out of the house on this rope.
And I can remember the house down by Hansman's Mills. There was a Barnes family down there, and a young woman by the name of Leela White. It was up on the second story screaming for somebody to come down and rescue her. And I don't know who did that, but they did get him out.
All through the night, the rain continued to fall without rest. By 4 a.m., Norwich, Oxford, Greene, Tyner, and Willett were all underwater, and the list went on and on. Telephone and power lines were down across the region, cutting off normal means of communication. Reports of horror began trickling in over shortwave radio. In Oxford, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Robbins were washed away in their home by raging Bowman Creek. In Pitcher, Jacob Naranzi was struck by lightning while milking in his barn and was killed. Robert Hartfield, a prominent Binghamton physician, lost control of his car and plunged into the old Chenango Canal and was killed. By 4 a.m., the waters that had washed through Lyle and Whitney Point and Smithville Flats were pouring into the Chenango River, and it was now rising at more than 4 feet an hour and rushing closer and closer to the Loomis family cottage in Chenango Bridge. When Harry Loomis awoke Monday morning, he knew nothing about the events overnight. It had rained barely an inch in Chenango Bridge, but he immediately heard the roar of the river and saw the water rising rapidly around the family cottage.
My dad went over to the neighbors to tell them that they'd better get moving because the water was coming up fast, and he had a bad feeling something was going to happen. And they had moved everything out on the pulley boat, and by the time we got to the pulley boat to start moving out, we couldn't find it even. We couldn't find the boat to get out, so he came back to the cottage and we started moving up to the rafters. The water started coming in on the porch, and he told us to get up on the table. We all got on the table, and we moved from the table to the buffet or whatever. And finally, when we got to the rafters, everybody was on the rafters, and the house started cracking. And we just sat there praying, you know, something would help us. And all of a sudden, there's 2 boats outside. We just got in the boats, and the house cracked apart. And it went down the river. I was with my mother, my brother, and we had a friend, Roland Brown. He was with us. He was in the same boat. My father was in the boat with Rosemary and Alice and our dog. And his boat immediately went in a whirlpool. Was just taken right down in. And it was forever, it seems, when he came up. When he came up, he only had his shorts on. Nobody else came up with him. My 2 sisters and the dog both all went. They were gone. And then a man came over and jumped in our boat and knocked the bottom out. So when he knocked it out, we all went under. And I remember praying. I was all alone under the water, kicking my feet and trying to clap my hands to make people hear me. And I took my cross and was praying. And in the meantime, I guess Clifford Gould got my brother in a tree. Our summer guest got my mother in a tree, and then he went looking for me. And when he got me, I found somebody, I felt somebody with me around my waist, holding me, and he put me in a tree, in the crook of a tree. They found our dog at the end over with the people on the shore. He had swam over there, but the two girls were gone. And my father was crying for them. The road was just lined with people hollering to us and telling us to hold on. Boats were coming down, like they would start right across the river and try to come right over to us. But the current was so swift that they would go way down the river, or they would crack up in a tree. We watched many boats crack up in the trees. And I don't know where those people went. I don't know if they drowned. There was quite a few of them. We were in the trees for 10 hours. When something like that's going on, you don't even recognize time. You don't think about it. Only you want to get out, get over where the other people are. And when we went over, we had lost the kids.
When the residents of Binghamton woke up to the morning newspaper, they read only scattered reports of flooding north of the city. The rain had spared the city, but its effect was about to make a violent arrival. By 10 a.m., the Chenango River had risen over 16 feet and was still climbing. The hordes of onlookers that had begun to line the Washington Street Bridge were witness to an unbelievable event. The Susquehanna River, unable to accept the surging Chenango, began to retreat backward, uphill, over the rock-bottom dam. At 11 o'clock, the Chenango started to spill over the shallow walls along Front Street.
The water was mostly kind of muddy, and it was going quite high and hitting some of the homes, around the homes there in the first ward. When you look from the hill south, the Kamikaze Curve, through that area, well, you look down there, and it was all around the homes.
The modest but well-kept homes in the city's blue-collar district became quickly engulfed by the muddy sludge. The muck and debris began to turn the elegant homes a sickly brownish color. The power went out, and sewers began to erupt under the pressure, smothering the air with a putrid odor. The river continued to push its way deep into the city's first ward. Police ordered anyone with a boat to help with the evacuation. Within 2 hours, the first floors of more than 300 homes were underwater. By 2 in the afternoon, the river was over 20 feet, its highest level in history. Every bridge was ordered closed to all traffic.
Well, when I was down and we're looking at the Washington Street Bridge, I noticed the traffic started closing down. Cars were stopping. They weren't coming. Well, that's when it dawned on me, hey, maybe they're closing the darn thing. So then I figured I'd better get up. I was down around the banks looking at the river. So then I decided I'd better go up there, and I seen the stopping people from going across. Well, I figured I'd better move. So I ran to get across the north side of the river. Because I know if I got south side, I don't know how to get home.
Police had just finished chasing spectators off the Ferry Street Bridge when a Sun Bulletin photographer snapped these photographs. The river had pounded the 40-year-old bridge to pieces. But the residents along Front Street near the bridge barely had time to notice. They were in a frantic race to save themselves and their few belongings. All morning long, the surging tide had been eating away at the earth supporting the massive townhouses along the river's edge. At 2 o'clock, all homes were ordered to evacuate. By 2:30, the O'Day house on Front Street began to crumble. An eyewitness described what she saw. The building fell over in one piece, as if a giant hand had pushed it. I'll never forget the sound it made as it evaporated under the Court Street Bridge. By evening, Binghamton was at a complete standstill. All bridges in and out of the city were closed. Water mains had shattered. There were no telephones and no electricity. And all across the city, thousands of people were huddled into makeshift shelters. Late that evening, in her hotel room, Marguerite Loomis, tired and grieving, began to write.
God, there's 2 new angels in heaven tonight. It's the first time they've ever been away overnight. Please, God, I always left a light outside their doors. So won't you leave 2 tiny stars turned on tonight so they won't feel so alone on their first night? Their little pillows were shaped to fit their heads and everything was so familiar to them. Please make it easier for them so they will feel at home with you as they did here with us.
The flood had wreaked havoc all across western and central New York. In Hornell, Main Street was almost completely destroyed and was still under 8 feet of water. In Watkins Glen, the entrance to the state park was virtually washed away, along with more than 50 homes. At Myers, near Ithaca, Salmon Creek had submerged the village, sweeping away a pedestrian bridge and taking with it John Salomon, 2 of his sons, and a nephew. The storms that produced the flooding finally ran out of steam over New England, but not before dumping more than 11 inches of rain in some areas, the highest levels of rainfall in the region's history. By Tuesday morning, the skies had begun to clear, and people had begun to emerge from the rubble.
It was so catastrophic, words didn't begin to reflect the nature of things. Everything was just a mess. Like overstuffed furniture, anything of that nature, everything was ruined.
First of all, it was quite an experience coming across the river bridge because the water was with 7 or 8 inches from the floor of it. And it was quite a little strange feeling walking across the bridge. And then when you first got over into town, it was okay, but when you came down Main Street and saw the houses on Main Street, people were shoveling dirt and muck. And there's a story about a woman throwing things out of the upstairs of her house. And people standing around gawking.
After the flood water had gone down, we came back home and there was big stumps and logs and everything else all over the lawns, the fields, and these logs and stumps were just crawling with snakes. There was snakes to no end. I can remember them things vividly. You found them all over the place.
It was probably a week that we were isolated here, more or less, and we got along the best they could.
In the end, the flood had killed 52 people. More than 9,000 homes were damaged or completely destroyed. Over 100 bridges and railroad trestles had been swept away. Farms and businesses were in utter ruins. In Smithville, Cincinnatus Lake had washed through the lower portions of Tarbell Farms, decimating its milling operations.
It was quite a devastation. After that, Tarbell Farms didn't do very well. It took a long time for the town to get back, probably 4 or 5 years.
The flood had been especially cruel to Lisle, where most of the village lay in ruins.
The pictures I've seen are just devastating. Huge chunks of concrete, probably from the roads, but just up on their sides. Wings taken off of houses, gravel and rocks all over. In fact, a lot of the farmers, their land was destroyed because of all the gravel.
I remember one man that came from Manningville up around over Owen Hill and come down, and he was saying, I've lost everything, I've lost all my stock. I don't know if I'll find any of them, and he was quite upset, of course. And walked down to where the water was, down a little hill. And people had got, some of the younger men had got up that way, even though the water was still very high, and told him that his brother's wife was one of the ones that was drowned, and he came back up and he said, I didn't lose anything. He says, I'm perfectly happy the way I am. He says, Ralph lost his wife and I didn't lose anything.
The structural damage paled in comparison to the loss of life in a town where everyone knew everyone else. 3 people were dead, including 10-year-old Lloyd Barrows.
He was the first young friend that I had lost. I'd lost grandparents and like that, aunts. But first playmate, really, that I had lost through death. And it was, I expect probably my mother talked to me pretty good. I can't remember about it, but it was a sad time. And then they couldn't find him. They had They had a bad time finding him. About a week before they found him.
Every day, I was in the crippled hospital by this time, and my dad went every day with grappling hooks. Would walk, just walk and walk, trying to find the girls. Rosemary was found within a week, I believe, because she was buried on Daddy's birthday, the 15th of July. She was 3, Rosemary. Then Alice was not found for a month and 4 days. And they went all the way down to Chenango Bridge. And she was under a tree. And they had Boots with them, that's our dog. And the dog rolled over her. He knew it was her. And that's how they found Alice. And the little girls that she started school with were her flower bearers at her funeral.
The devastation in the region had made national headlines. Relief began pouring in from around the country. New York Governor Herbert Lehman arrived by week's end to survey the damage and pressed for government support. But the devastation had also attracted looters, transients, and curiosity seekers from as far away as Florida.
People came from all over to see the flood damage in Loyal. Well, any place where it had hit bad, they did, as far as that goes. My sister and a friend of hers took a lot of pictures and had a lot of copies made up, and she sold them. I have no idea what she got for a picture, but she was getting ready to go into her last year of college at Cortland, and she made enough off in her pictures to help out a great deal in their last year of college.
But nowhere did people gather more than at what remained of the Ford home in Smithville Flats, which had become known as the Crazy House.
The Crazy House is something you can't imagine unless you've been through it. It was tipped in such a way that if you was going up a little hill, you thought you were going down. You could not hold yourself. And if you was going the opposite direction, you felt different that way. You just can't imagine the feeling it gives you. And you come out of it and you wonder, whatever tipped it in such a way that it's strange.
She charged 10 cents a person for a long time, and there was a lot of people came here to see it, but sometimes the cars would be stretched for half a mile down the road here. But on Sundays, people come out and go to the Crazy House. They didn't have that many theme parks in those days, so it was something to do.
Probably one of the most exciting things was that President Franklin D. Roosevelt came to town with the governor of New York at the time, and they drove down Main Street, stopped up here in the middle of the street, and they drove up the Upper Lisle Road and probably Lisle and all around the area, and they were assessing the damage that was done.
The flood had exposed a severe flaw in the watershed. The waters from the north and higher ground were allowed to flow freely, unobstructed, through what had become heavily populated areas. A $200,000 survey by the Army Corps of Engineers was immediately ordered. But some believed that the July rains were a fluke, and a flood of that magnitude was not likely to occur for another 100 years. That debate ended the following spring. In March of 1936, Heavy spring rains and rapid melting snow once again pushed the rivers over their banks. For the second time in 8 months, the southern tier and western New York were underwater. A massive flood control plan was pushed into action, forever changing the landscape of the area.
Fortunately, the federal government got into the act and built the reservoirs that have prevented a reoccurrence, and of course built the flood walls along the rivers. And they didn't do it all immediately. It came over a period of years.
Construction of a dam and reservoir at Whitney Point, where the Tiafneoga and Otselic rivers meet, was completed in 1942. The reservoir manages the flow of water from the upper valley that enters the Chenango River.
The dam at the Whitney Point Reservoir, it's flood control. It has saved the people living further on down the Tiafneoga. Flood control also provides recreation for the area now, and a sanctuary for birds and animals at the northern end of it.
Nearly 70 years later, the boat and bathhouses along the rivers are gone. An empty field of trees and grass have grown over the remains of Tarbell Farms. And in Lisle, a 10-foot stone fortress runs through the village, forever standing guard and forever a reminder of the night of the Great Flood.
Funds for WSKG's The Flood of 35, furnished by the Savage Agency of Binghamton, providing a full range of insurance services to the local community for over 50 years.